So here's the equation we're going to use for our first example. And remember, before you can do anything with the quadratic formula, you better move all of the terms to one side. So we're going to start off by adding 3 to both sides, and we're going to have 5x squared plus 8x plus 3 equaling 0. Okay? And now if it helps to write out what your values are, make sure you do that. Again, make sure you're paying attention to the signs of all of these. A in this case is 5, B is 8, and C is 3. They're all positive in this case. So I'm just going to plug this in. Again, you have to have it memorized. So x equals negative b, which means the opposite sign of b. So negative 8 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 8 squared is 64, minus 4 times a, which is 5, times c, which is 3. And all of that needs to be in the square root. And this is all over 2 times a. Okay, and again, we're just going to go and simplify everything from here. So x equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 minus 60. And that's all over 10. That simplifies to negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 4 all over 10, which is negative 8 plus or minus 2 over 10. Now remember, we're going to get a potential of 2 answers here because of this exponent. And that's why it's very important to have both a plus and a minus. Now if you can simplify it, then you should simplify it. Okay, so we can do this. This is very easy to simplify. We're going to just have two separate answers here. One of them is x equals negative 8 plus 2 over 10. Okay, and that one's going to simplify to negative 6 over 10, which is negative 3/5. And the other answer we're going to get would be x equals negative 8 minus 2 over 10, which is negative 10 over 10, which is negative 1. Okay, so we do have our 2 answers. And again, if you want to plug those in to see if they work, just to verify, you can do that and you should get a true statement. So at first glance, this looks like an identical problem as the one we just did. But you have to be very careful, and you should notice that your B and C term are now negative, and so that's going to make a difference on what happens. So again, if you want to write out what they are before you start, that might be a good idea. So you get A is 5, B is negative 8, and C is negative 3. Okay, we're just going to plug it into the formula. And until you have it memorized, it's probably a good idea just to write it down every single time. Okay, but you do need it memorized. So x equals negative b is what the formula says, but we already have a negative 8, so negative b means that it becomes a positive 8, plus or minus the square root of b squared. You're going to square the negative here, so it's 64, minus 4 times a times c. And again, you got to really watch out for your signs. All that's in the square root, all over 2 times a. And now we're just going to simplify. So it's 8 plus or minus the square root of 64 plus 60 all over 10. So that gives us 8 plus or minus the square root of 124 over 10, And now if we can, we'd like to factor this, or I'm sorry, to simplify this. If this is unsimplifiable, right, then this is actually your answer. Okay, there's still two answers here because you would say 8 plus the square root of 124 divided by 10, and 8 minus the square root of 124 divided by 10. But if we can simplify it down a little bit, that's what you should try to do. And I know that 124 is the same as 31 times 4. Okay, so this is the same as 8 plus or minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 31 all over 10, which is the same as 8 plus or minus 2 radical 31 over 10. And now every term, or the top two terms anyway, are both divisible by 2 as well as the denominator. Okay, so since all three, and it has to be all three, are divisible by 2, we can simplify this down one more step so that we get x equals 4, because 8 divided by 2 is 4, plus or minus, the 2 is going to cancel and you're left with 1 radical 31 all over 5. And that's as good as you need to get. This is your answer. Okay, you have to remember that there are two answers here, 4 plus square root of 31 divided by 5, and 4 minus the square root of 31 divided by 5. But you don't have to separate them if you're just answering this question. So here's the equation we'll use for our final example. And again, you have to have the equation set equal to 0. So for the first step, I'm going to add the x to both sides, and I'm going to write it in descending order. And that's just because that's what that's what I'm used to looking at. Okay? And it's easier to determine what your A is, what your B is, and what your C is. Okay, so again, I'm going to write those down so I know what I'm looking at. A is 1, B is 1, and C is 2. And now I'm just going to plug it into the quadratic formula. We've got x equals negative b, so negative 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 1 squared is 1, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 2, all of that inside the square root, and all over 2 times a, so 2 times 1. And again, all we're doing is simplifying now. So you get negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 minus 8 all over 2. And that simplifies to negative 1 plus or minus the square root of negative 7 over 2. Okay, and this isn't done because we have this square root of a negative. Okay, and so you need to make sure that you're changing that into imaginary numbers. And this is really the beauty of the of using the quadratic formula. You can find roots of imaginary the imaginary roots also. Okay, not only can you find the real ones, real or irrational, or I'm sorry, rational or rational, but you can also find any imaginary numbers too. So remember, if you have a square root of a negative number, all you're doing is pulling the I out. And so your final answer on this would be negative 1 plus or minus I radical 7 over 2. Okay, and we check, to see if we can simplify any further, but 2 does not go into either of the numerators, and so this is going to be our final answer.